Margaret Chen shuffled forward in the security line at Denver International Airport, her weathered hands gripping the handles of her worn canvas travel bag. At 72, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned that rushing only led to accidents. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a modest blue cardigan over comfortable slacks. To anyone watching, she looked like countless other elderly travelers making their way home after visiting family. The line moved slowly, as it always did during the afternoon rush. Margaret didn't mind. She had nowhere urgent to be, and after decades of learning patience the hard way, a few extra minutes in an airport queue hardly registered as an inconvenience. She watched the younger passengers around her, tapping on their phones, checking their watches, sighing with impatience. She remembered being that way once, when every minute had seemed precious, and time had felt like something that could slip away if you weren't careful. "Next," called the TSA agent. A young man with close-cropped hair and the kind of officious manner that suggested he took his job very seriously. Margaret approached the podium, fishing her driver's license and boarding pass from the small purse she kept strapped across her shoulder. The agent examined her documents with the routine efficiency of someone who had checked thousands of IDs that day. "Denver to Seattle?" he asked, though he was already reading the information. "Yes, visiting my daughter," Margaret replied with a gentle smile. "She just had her first baby, my first grandchild." The agent's expression softened slightly as he handed back her documents. "Congratulations. Have a safe flight, Mrs. Chen." Margaret made her way to the X-ray machines, beginning the familiar ritual of removing her shoes, placing her bag in a gray plastic bin, and walking through the metal detector. She had traveled this route dozens of times over the years, visiting her daughter Sarah in Seattle, and the process had become as routine as brushing her teeth. The machine beeped as she stepped through, and Margaret sighed inwardly. It was probably the small titanium plate in her left knee, a souvenir from a hiking accident 15 years earlier. The female TSA agent who waved her aside was professional but brusque. "Just a routine pat-down, ma'am. Please step over here." Margaret complied, raising her arms as instructed. The pat-down was thorough, but respectful, and within a minute, she was cleared to collect her belongings. She looked toward the X-ray station where her bag should have been waiting, but instead saw two agents huddled over the monitor, their voices too low to hear. One of them, a stern-faced woman with graying temples, looked up and called out, "Ma'am, we need to do a manual inspection of your bag. Could you step over here, please?" Margaret's heart skipped slightly, but she kept her expression calm. She had nothing to hide. After all, just the usual contents of an elderly woman's travel bag: medications, reading glasses, a paperback novel, some knitting, and a few personal items she was bringing to show her new grandson. "Is there a problem?" she asked mildly as she approached the inspection table. "Just routine," the agent replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. She lifted Margaret's canvas bag onto the metal table, and Margaret noticed that several other agents had begun to drift over, their curiosity apparently piqued by something on the X-ray screen. The lead agent unzipped the bag and began removing items methodically. Out came Margaret's prescription bottles, neatly labeled and stored in a small plastic organizer. Then her reading glasses in their worn leather case, followed by the romance novel she'd been reading on the flight to Denver. "This is a lovely bag," commented a younger agent, running her fingers over the canvas. "Looks like it's seen some travel." Margaret smiled. "It has. I've had it for almost 40 years. My late husband bought it for me when we took our first overseas trip together." The agents continued their search, removing Margaret's knitting supplies, her small toiletry bag, and a manila envelope containing photographs she'd printed to show her daughter. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Exactly what you'd expect to find in the bag of a grandmother traveling to meet her grandchild for the first time. But then the lead agent's hand encountered something deeper in the bag, tucked into a zippered compartment that Margaret rarely opened anymore. The agent's fingers closed around a small, hard object wrapped in tissue paper. "What's this?" the agent murmured, more to herself than to Margaret. She carefully unwrapped the tissue, revealing a small wooden box, about the size of a deck of cards. It was beautiful in its simplicity, made of dark wood that had been polished to a deep shine. There was no obvious way to open it, no visible hinges or latches. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. And for the first time since entering the security area, her composure wavered. That's very personal," she said quietly. The agent looked up at her with renewed interest. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we need to examine all items. How does this open?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, then reached out with shaking fingers. She pressed a small section of the wood grain, and the box opened with a soft click. The mechanism was so seamless that it seemed like magic to the watching agents. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay a small metal insignia. It was roughly circular, about the size of a silver dollar, with an intricate design that none of the agents recognized immediately. But there was something about it that commanded respect. Something in the weight of the metal and the precision of the craftsmanship that suggested it was far more important than its modest size would indicate. The lead agent lifted it carefully, turning it over in her palm. On one side was an eagle with outstretched wings, surrounded by stars. On the reverse was text too small to read without magnification, and what appeared to be a serial number. "Ma'am, what exactly is this?" the agent asked, her voice taking on a more serious tone. Margaret looked around at the circle of faces watching her, all suddenly very interested in what had seemed like a routine bag search. She could see the curiosity in their eyes, the professional alertness that had replaced their earlier casual efficiency. "It's a commendation," she said simply. "What kind of commendation?" the agent pressed. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the insignia in the agent's palm. Finally, she spoke, her voice so soft that the agents had to lean in to hear her. "For service to my country." The words hung in the air, loaded with meaning that none of them quite understood yet. The lead agent looked more closely at the insignia, noting details she had missed in her first examination. The metal was silver, but not ordinary silver. It had the distinctive weight and luster of something precious, something made to last forever. The eagle was rendered in extraordinary detail, each feather precisely defined, each star perfectly formed. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to verify this with my supervisor," the agent said. But her tone had changed completely. Where before there had been routine authority, now there was something approaching deference. Margaret nodded silently, understanding that her quiet flight to Seattle had just become something else entirely. She watched as the agent walked quickly toward a glass-walled office at the far end of the security area, the insignia still cradled carefully in her hand. The remaining agents stood around the inspection table, unsure what to do next. The atmosphere had shifted in a way that none of them quite understood, but they all felt it. This wasn't just an elderly woman with a family heirloom anymore. This was something else. Margaret stood quietly beside her unpacked belongings, her hands folded in front of her, waiting with the same patient dignity she had shown in the security line. But inside, her mind was racing back through the decades to a time when she had been someone entirely different, when that insignia had represented the most important thing in her life, when carrying it had meant something that most people could never understand. She had kept it hidden for so long that she had almost forgotten the weight of what it represented. Almost, but not quite. Some things you never truly forget. No matter how much time passes, no matter how different your life becomes, some things stay with you forever, waiting in small wooden boxes for the day when they're discovered again. As she watched the supervisor emerge from his office and walk toward them, Margaret Chen prepared herself to explain something that she hadn't talked about in 20 years. She prepared herself to remember who she used to be before she became just another grandmother traveling to see her family. The insignia glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights, its silver surface reflecting the faces of the agents gathered around it. None of them realized it yet, but they were about to learn that appearances could be deceiving. That the quiet elderly woman in front of them had once been someone extraordinary, someone whose service to her country had earned her one of the highest honors that could be bestowed. They were about to discover that Margaret Chen was much more than she appeared to be. Supervisor James Rodriguez had been working airport security for 15 years, and he prided himself on being able to read situations quickly. But as he approached the inspection table, studying the small metal object in his agent's hand, he felt a familiar tingle of uncertainty. The Insignia was unlike anything he had encountered before, and the elderly woman standing beside her scattered belongings had an air about her that didn't match her appearance. "Let me see that," he said quietly, extending his hand toward Agent Martinez. She placed the Insignia carefully in his palm, and Rodriguez felt its surprising weight immediately. This wasn't costume jewelry or a souvenir shop trinket. This was real military hardware, crafted with the precision and materials reserved for the highest levels of recognition. He turned it over slowly, examining both sides. The eagle was magnificent, but it was the text on the reverse that made him pause. He couldn't make out all the words without his reading glasses, but he could see enough. Intelligence service, and what appeared to be a classification level that made his blood pressure spike. Rodriguez had served in the army for 8 years before joining TSA, long enough to recognize when he was looking at something far above his clearance level. He glanced up at Margaret, who stood watching him with calm, patient eyes that suddenly seemed to hold depths he hadn't noticed before. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'm going to need to make some phone calls. Would you mind having a seat while we sort this out?" He gestured toward a row of chairs near the security office, and Margaret nodded graciously. "Of course. Take all the time you need." As she settled into a chair with the same dignity she had shown throughout the entire process, Rodriguez felt increasingly certain that he was dealing with something significant. Everything about her demeanor suggested someone accustomed to being questioned, someone who understood that certain things required verification and was prepared to wait while proper channels were followed. Rodriguez retreated to his office and closed the door. He sat down at his desk, still holding the Insignia, and reached for his phone. His first call was to the TSA regional office, but after a brief conversation, he was transferred to someone else, and then to someone else again. Each transfer came with the same message. What he was describing was outside their normal scope. Finally, he found himself connected to a number in Washington that he'd never had reason to call before. The voice that answered was crisp and professional, with the kind of authority that suggested the person on the other end was accustomed to handling unusual situations. "This is Colonel Harrison, Defense Intelligence Agency. You say you have a medal or insignia that needs verification?" Rodriguez described what he was looking at, reading the serial number carefully. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of rapid typing. "Can you describe the woman who was carrying this?" Colonel Harrison asked, his tone suddenly much more focused. Rodriguez provided Margaret's name and general description, then waited while more typing ensued. The pause that followed was even longer than the first one. "Mr. Rodriguez," Colonel Harrison said finally, "I need you to treat this situation with extreme discretion. The person you're dealing with, she's someone we've been trying to locate for quite some time. Is she dangerous?" Rodriguez asked, glancing through his office window toward where Margaret sat reading her paperback novel, looking for all the world like someone's harmless grandmother. "Dangerous? No. But she is someone we owe a considerable debt to. That insignia she's carrying, there are fewer than 50 people alive who have earned the right to possess one. She's one of the most highly decorated intelligence operatives in the history of the United States government." Rodriguez felt his mouth go dry. Intelligence operative? For 30 years, she operated in some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. Deep cover assignments in hostile countries, extracting assets from behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence that prevented more conflicts than most people will ever know about. She was legendary in certain circles. Through his window, Rodriguez watched Margaret turn a page in her book, completely absorbed in her reading. The contrast between what he was hearing and what he was seeing was almost surreal. "What should I do?" he asked. "Treat her with the respect she's earned. Give her back her insignia. Apologize for the inconvenience. And make sure she gets on her flight without any further delays." "And Mr. Rodriguez?" "Yes, sir. This conversation never happened. What you've learned today stays with you, and only you. Is that understood?" Rodriguez hung up the phone with his head spinning. He sat for a moment, staring at the insignia in his hand, trying to reconcile what he'd just learned with the quiet, elderly woman sitting in his security area. Finally, he stood up and walked back out to where Margaret was waiting. She looked up as he approached, her expression mildly curious but not concerned. It was the expression of someone who had waited for debriefings and clearances countless times before. Someone for whom this kind of delay was simply part of the process. "Mrs. Chen," Rodriguez said, extending the insignia toward her. "I want to apologize for the delay. Everything checks out." Margaret accepted the insignia with a small nod, wrapping it carefully back in its tissue paper and returning it to the wooden box. "No apology necessary. You were just doing your job." But Rodriguez couldn't leave it at that. Now that he knew who he was talking to, he needed to say something, even if he couldn't acknowledge what he'd learned. "Ma'am, I served in the army for 8 years. I just want you to know that it's an honor to meet you." Margaret looked up at him sharply, her eyes suddenly alert in a way they hadn't been before. For just a moment, he caught a glimpse of the person she must have been in the field, assessing threats, reading situations, making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. "Thank you," she said quietly, "but I think you may have me confused with someone else." Rodriguez nodded, understanding that he was being told to drop the subject. "Of course. Again, my apologies for the delay. Agent Martinez will help you repack your bag." As Martinez began carefully replacing Margaret's belongings, Rodriguez noticed other details he had missed before. The way Margaret's eyes automatically scanned the area around her, cataloging exits and potential threats. The way she positioned herself so she could see the entire security area while appearing to be focused on her repacking. The unconscious habits of someone who had spent decades staying alive in dangerous situations. Her bag, too, told a story now that he knew what to look for. It wasn't just old. It was well-traveled in a way that suggested far more than tourist destinations. There were small repairs that spoke of hard use, careful maintenance that indicated someone who understood the importance of reliable equipment. Even her choice of clothing made more sense now. Comfortable, practical, easily replaceable if necessary. "All set, Mrs. Chen," Martinez said, zipping up the bag and handing it back to Margaret. "Thank you for your patience." "Arlie." Margaret stood and shouldered her bag with an easy motion that spoke of long practice. "Thank you for your professionalism. You're all doing important work." Rodriguez watched her walk toward her gate, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who knew exactly where she was going and how long it would take to get there. Even in retirement, even after all these years, she moved like an operative. As she disappeared into the crowd of travelers, Rodriguez wondered about her story. What missions had she completed? What secrets did she carry? What had she sacrificed in service to her country? The insignia in that wooden box represented a lifetime of service that most people would never understand, or even know had happened. He thought about her destination, Seattle, to visit her daughter and meet her grandchild. After everything she had done, after all the dangers she had faced, she was traveling to experience one of life's simplest and most profound joys. Holding her grandchild for the first time, it struck him as both perfectly ordinary and extraordinarily moving. This woman who had once operated in the shadows, protecting her country from threats that most citizens never knew existed, was now just another grandmother excited to meet her family's newest member. Rodriguez returned to his office, but found it difficult to concentrate on his routine duties. He kept thinking about the phone call, about the respect in Colonel Harrison's voice when he had spoken about Margaret Chen. "Someone we owe a considerable debt to," he had said. One of the most highly decorated intelligence operatives in the history of the United States government. And yet she had stood there patiently while they searched her bag, answering questions politely, never once suggesting that she was anyone other than an ordinary traveler. There had been no demands for special treatment, no mention of her service, no expectation that her background should shield her from normal security procedures. It was, Rodriguez thought, exactly how a real professional would handle the situation. Someone who had spent decades maintaining cover identities would know how to blend in, how to be invisible even when standing in plain sight. The best operatives weren't the ones who drew attention to themselves, but the ones who could disappear into any crowd, who could be anyone they needed to be. As the afternoon wore on and the security line returned to its normal routine, Rodriguez found himself wondering how many other quiet heroes passed through his checkpoint without anyone knowing who they really were. How many seemingly ordinary people carried extraordinary stories, extraordinary service, extraordinary sacrifices hidden beneath unremarkable exteriors? Margaret Chen's flight would be boarding soon, and she would take her seat among other passengers who would never know they were traveling with a legend. She would chat politely with whoever sat next to her, probably showing them pictures of her new grandchild, deflecting any conversation about herself with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime keeping secrets. And in a few hours, she would walk off that plane in Seattle, where her daughter would be waiting, excited to introduce her mother to the newest member of their family. It would be a moment of pure joy, unmarked by any hint of the extraordinary life that had led Margaret to this simple, beautiful destination. Flight 447 to Seattle was routine in every way that mattered to Margaret Chen. She settled into her window seat, stored her canvas bag carefully in the overhead compartment, and prepared for the 2-hour flight with the practiced efficiency of someone who had flown countless times before. The businessman who took the middle seat beside her barely glanced up from his laptop, and the young woman in the aisle seat was already absorbed in her phone. Perfect. Margaret preferred anonymity, especially after the unexpected attention at security. She pulled out her paperback novel and tried to lose herself in the familiar comfort of someone else's story, but her mind kept drifting back to the wooden box in her bag and the memories it contained. She hadn't meant to bring the insignia with her. In fact, she had thought it was safely tucked away in her bedroom safe back in Denver, along with her other mementos from a life she had officially left behind 20 years ago. But when she was packing for this trip, something had made her reach for it. Some instinct she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the significance of the moment. Meeting her first grandchild felt like such an important milestone, and the insignia represented the most important work of her life. Or maybe, she thought with a wry smile, she was just getting old and forgetful, and had grabbed it without thinking. The plane lifted off smoothly, climbing through the late afternoon clouds toward the mountainous horizon. Margaret watched the landscape fall away beneath her, thinking about all the other flights she had taken over the years, to places she couldn't name and for reasons she could never discuss. Those had been different times, when every trip was a mission and every destination was a puzzle to be solved. She had been younger then, driven by a sense of purpose that had sustained her through years of separation from family, years of living as someone she wasn't, years of making decisions that affected lives and nations in ways that would never be acknowledged publicly. The insignia represented the culmination of that career. Recognition for services that few people would ever know about. She had received it in a ceremony so classified that even now, 20 years later, she couldn't discuss the details. But she remembered the weight of it in her hand, the pride she had felt, and the bitter knowledge that it was also goodbye to the only life she had known for 3 decades. "Excuse me," said the young woman in the aisle seat, leaning across her seatmate. "I couldn't help but notice your book. I read that one last month. Did you get to the part where she discovers the secret room yet?" Margaret smiled. "Not yet. I'm still early in the story. You're going to love it. The author has such a great way of building suspense." They chatted briefly about books, and Margaret found herself enjoying the simple pleasure of a conversation that had no hidden agenda, no coded messages, no careful probing for information. Just 2 readers, sharing their enthusiasm for a good story. As the plane began its descent into Seattle, Margaret's thoughts turned to her daughter Sarah and son-in-law Michael. They had been so excited about the baby, calling her every few days with updates about preparations, sharing ultrasound photos, asking for advice about everything from cribs to car seats. Sarah had been 8 when Margaret retired from government consulting, as she had always described her work to her family. Old enough to have noticed her mother's long absences, the late-night phone calls, the way Margaret sometimes seemed to be listening to conversations happening 2 rooms away, but young enough to accept her mother's explanations without too many questions. It had taken years to build a normal relationship with her daughter after retirement. Years of learning how to be present, how to focus on everyday concerns, how to be just a mother instead of someone who was always partly somewhere else. Thinking about operational security and exit strategies, and the 100 small details that kept people alive in dangerous situations. Now Sarah was 38. A successful architect married to a pediatrician, living in a beautiful home in Queen Anne, with a view of Elliott Bay. She had built exactly the kind of stable, conventional life that Margaret had always hoped for her, far removed from the shadows and secrets that had defined her own career. The plane touched down at SeaTac Airport, right on schedule, and Margaret gathered her belongings with the same methodical care she brought to everything. As she made her way through the terminal, she spotted Sarah waiting at the arrivals gate, bouncing slightly with excitement, her hands clasped in front of her rounded belly that had been flat just 9 days earlier. "Mom!" Sarah rushed forward, wrapping Margaret in a careful hug that accommodated her post-delivery condition. "I'm so glad you're here. Wait until you see him. He's perfect, Mom. Just absolutely perfect." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, surprised by the sudden surge of emotion. After all these years, after everything she had seen and done, it was her daughter's joy that could still move her to tears. "How are you feeling, sweetheart? You look wonderful." "Tired, but amazing. Michael's at the hospital finishing rounds, but he'll be home for dinner. And Thomas is sleeping right now, but he should be waking up soon. Oh, Mom, I can't wait for you to hold him." They collected Margaret's luggage and made their way to Sarah's car, chattering about the flight, the baby, the recovery. As they drove through Seattle's familiar streets, Margaret found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. This was why she had retired, why she had walked away from the work that had defined her for so long. For moments like this, ordinary moments with the people who mattered most, Sarah's house was exactly as Margaret remembered it from her last visit, warm and welcoming, with photographs covering every surface and plants thriving in every corner. But now there were new additions. A bassinet in the living room, a changing station set up in the corner, baby clothes hanging on a drying rack in the laundry room. "He's upstairs sleeping," Sarah whispered as they entered. "The doctor said newborns sleep about 16 hours a day, but it doesn't feel like it." They made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, Sarah filling Margaret in on all the details of the delivery, the first few days at home, the overwhelming reality of being responsible for this tiny new person. Margaret listened with the complete attention she had once reserved for mission briefings, absorbing every detail, asking the right questions, offering comfort and encouragement. When a soft cry drifted down from upstairs, Sarah's face lit up. "That's him. Ready to meet your grandson?" They climbed the stairs to the nursery, a sunny room painted in soft yellows and greens, with a rocking chair by the window and shelves lined with children's books. In the crib, wrapped in a blue blanket, was the smallest person Margaret had ever seen. Sarah lifted the baby with practiced ease, and Margaret got her first good look at Thomas Michael Chen Rodriguez. He was indeed perfect, with a shock of dark hair and his father's olive complexion, tiny fingers that gripped at the air as he settled into his mother's arms. "Would you like to hold him?" Sarah asked. Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Sarah placed the baby carefully in her arms, and Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. A fierce, protective instinct that surprised her with its intensity. This was her grandson. This tiny, vulnerable person who would never know about the world his grandmother had helped protect, who would grow up safe and secure because of work done by people like her, people who had chosen to stand between innocence and danger. As she held Thomas, feeling his tiny weight against her chest, Margaret thought about the choices she had made, the prices she had paid, the things she had sacrificed. There had been times, especially in the early years, when she had wondered if it was worth it, if the work justified the personal costs. Looking down at Thomas's peaceful face, she knew it had been. "He's beautiful, Sarah. Just perfect." They spent the afternoon together, Margaret holding Thomas while Sarah rested, learning his feeding schedule, his sleeping patterns, the tiny sounds he made when he was content. When Michael came home from the hospital, Margaret got to see her son-in-law in a completely new role, transformed from confident doctor to nervous new father in a way that was both touching and amusing. Over dinner, they talked about everything and nothing, the conversation flowing easily between plans for the nursery, Margaret's garden back in Denver, and Michael's work at the children's hospital. Normal family conversation. The kind Margaret had dreamed about during long nights in foreign cities. Wondering what her daughter was doing, whether she was happy, whether she understood why her mother had to be away so much. After dinner, As they sat in the living room with Thomas sleeping in his bassinet between them, Sarah brought up something that Margaret had been expecting. "Mom, I've been thinking about writing down some family history for Thomas. Things about his grandparents, where we came from, that kind of thing. I know Dad died when I was little, but I don't really know much about what you did for work. I mean, I know you worked for the government, but you never talked about it much." Margaret chose her words carefully. "I did consulting work for various agencies. Policy analysis, research, that sort of thing. Nothing very exciting." Sarah nodded, accepting the explanation as she always had. But then she looked directly at her mother with an expression Margaret recognized. The look of someone who had finally decided to ask a question they'd been avoiding for years. "Were you ever in danger, Mom? I mean, really in danger?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her grandson's sleeping face. How could she explain that danger had been her constant companion for 30 years? That she had survived situations that would have killed most people? That the insignia in her bag represented not just honor, but survival against odds that no one should have to face? "Sometimes," she said finally, "but I always came home." "And now you're really retired?" Margaret smiled, thinking about the wooden box upstairs in her luggage. "Yes, sweetheart, really retired. These days, the most dangerous thing I do is drive to the grocery store." Sarah laughed. And the moment passed, the question answered as much as it could be. Some stories, Margaret thought, were not meant to be told. Not because they were shameful, but because they belonged to a world that should never touch the people you love most. As the evening wound down and Thomas woke for his last feeding before bed, Margaret felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow she would help Sarah with the baby, maybe cook dinner for the family, take a walk around the neighborhood. Simple things, ordinary things. The kind of life she had protected but never thought she would get to live herself. The insignia upstairs represented who she had been, the work she had done, the recognition she had earned. But sitting here with her daughter and grandson, she realized that this moment represented something even more valuable. The chance to be exactly who she appeared to be, nothing more and nothing less than a grandmother who had traveled across the country to hold her grandchild for the first time. Outside, Seattle settled into its evening rhythm, the lights of the city twinkling across Elliott Bay. Somewhere in the distance, planes were taking off from SeaTac, carrying passengers to destinations around the world. Some of them might be operatives heading to assignments, living the life Margaret had once known. But that was their story now. Their responsibility, their burden, and their honor. Margaret's story had entered a new chapter. One measured not in missions accomplished, but in moments shared. Not in secrets kept, but in love given freely. And as she watched Sarah gently rock Thomas to sleep, she knew it was the best chapter yet.